I was researching for my book, which is called Seasick, and it's about how the ocean is being affected by carbon. And so I traveled all over the world with scientists to try to figure out what they were finding out about the ocean and how humans are affecting the ocean. And one of the first journeys was to Panama with this marvelous scientist named Nancy Knowlton, who studies corals. And she said to me, why don't you come down to Panama with me and we'll watch a coral spawning? And I had no idea what a coral spawning was. And she said that they're very, very rare. It's rare for scientists to be able to see them. They only found out about coral spawnings in the 1980s. And so I said, how do corals know when to spawn? Because what happens is that all these little corals, they can't move, they have no brains, they only have one orifice, and yet they know, all of them at the same time, that they have to have sex at the same moment, this grand oceanic orgy on a coral reef, and it all has to happen at the precise same moment, or you don't get any baby corals. So I said to her, how did they know when to do this? And she said she wasn't sure, but nobody knows for sure how these corals can keep time, but it seems to have something to do with the alignment of the earth and the sun and the moon. And so the corals that we were watching, can you imagine the corals that we were watching? They spawned 5 to 7 days after the last full moon of summer at 100 minutes after sunset, all at the same time. And it was just amazing, So here we are in the ocean, and we're watching, and we've been monitoring these corals for several days to see, are they going to do it? Are they going to do it? There's a team from around the world of marine biologists looking at these things to see whether they're going to spawn. And so we get in the water on the 6th day after the last full moon of summer. And we know for sure that tonight is the night. This is the night that they're going to spawn, because the reef is just alive with all this electricity. You can just feel it coursing through your body, and the whole reef just feels like it's, that there's something happening. And so we get in the water, and at exactly 100 minutes after sunset, all of these corals start to let loose these little pink bundles of egg and sperm, and they rise to the surface, and they explode in the surface, and they combine, and there's this sort of ectoplasmic slick that spreads everywhere, and all of a sudden you have all these baby corals in the making, and it's the most extraordinary experience. It's very, very uncommon for humans to witness it. It's very uncommon for scientists to track it, and it's one of those absolutely unforgettable. The smell alone is unforgettable. You just are sort of, you're sort of sodden with this coral spawn. It's just amazing, and it's all somehow tied to the rhythms of the moon. And these little creatures are able somehow to track what the moon is doing and to respond to it. And it's one of those great mysteries of life in the ocean. This is such a great question, because it's one of the things that scientists have wrestled with over the years, because the folklore tells us that animals are tightly tied to the rhythms of the moon. And scientists said, well, wait a sec, maybe that's not right. Let's test that empirically. And so they started to set up all of these experiments to see. And what they found is that there is absolutely no question that these mysterious rhythms of the moon affect how creatures conduct their lives, and not just their lives, but the most important parts of their lives. So when they reproduce, when they feed, how they move, where they move, all of those things are tightly tied to what's happening with the moon. And so you have, for example, a type of fiddler crab that is able to sense both the cycles of the sun and also able to sense the cycles of the moon. In the same creature, the same little tiny creature, you have this ability to do that. You have creatures that must know what the moon is doing before they can know whether it's time to reproduce, like the corals, for example, are one of those things. But it's not just corals; it's animals throughout the ocean, and not just in the ocean, but also on land, too. They tie in these very complex rhythms that humans still aren't able to understand fully. They tie these basic survival patterns to the rhythms of the moon. I think it's almost countercultural for some scientists to look at this because it feels like it's an ancient wisdom, and scientists are trying to find a new wisdom, a new way of understanding the world. And this is a very ancient, primeval way of understanding the world. So, I mean, the really on the edge of that, you have these scientists who are trying to make the two, see if the two connect. And then you look at fisher, people who fish, and they know absolutely by their catches, by what they're able to see in the marine creatures that they catch, that the creatures' lives are tied to the moon. So you have all this, this wisdom from humans who are looking at the ocean and catching creatures from it, who also know that there's this wisdom in animals, this calendar, if you will, in animals that is part of the moon's cycle. This is another fascinating area of human research. So scientists, again, for a long time, because we have all this language, you are a lunatic, you are loony, you are, this is all moon language. And it's all derogatory. It's all that you're somehow, if you are tied to the moon somehow, you're not quite all there. It goes back to these ancient myths of werewolves and transformative change during the full moon and all this kind of stuff. And so scientists have been a bit reluctant to wade in there. But several years ago, there was a study, and it came out of Switzerland. So this was it's a really famous study, and what the scientists did was put their subjects into a sleep lab. So they had no outside light. They had no light cues from the sun or the moon or anything. And they just watched them sleep. And they took samples of their blood, and they looked at their brain waves and their heart rates and all that kind of stuff. And did a bunch of analysis of it. And then a few years later, this same group of scientists was sitting in a pub somewhere and said, what if there is a connection to the moon, the lunar cycles in all of this? So they weren't looking for a connection to lunar cycles. They just thought, we have these data. Why don't we go back and look at them and track them against what was happening in the lunar cycles at that time? What they found amazed them. What they found was that there was a noticeable lack of sleep in the subjects, and lack of deep sleep, more particularly, during a full moon. And you can track it, and you can see. It's fascinating to look at the charts, because they in the paper they wrote about this. They have the phases of the moon across the top of one chart, and then they track the sleep and the melatonin and the brain waves, and they all have this very statistically significant dip just when there's a full moon. So there's this evidence somehow that these mysterious cycles of the moon, these ancient cycles, are still affecting humans and how we act in the most fundamental way. In other words, how we sleep, how we are able to sleep. And it makes sense if you think about it. We must have evolved during a time when it was important to be active during the full moon, when you could hunt, or you could do all these activities that allowed you to survive. And so there's still this remnant of the ability to perceive and to respond to the tug of the moon, even today in humans. It's fascinating. We don't think of ourselves as lunar, but we also don't think of ourselves as oceanic. And of course, they're linked. The moon governs the tides, when the tides are. And it's not just the moon, it's also the relationship of the moon and where it is compared to the sun. I mean, that's all built into the tidal system of our planet. And the tidal system of our planet is linked into the reproductive cycles of creatures and the feeding cycles of creatures. So they're all connected. But just as we don't think of ourselves as lunar, we don't think of ourselves as part of a planet that is mainly ocean. But from the planet's point of view, 99% of the living space is in the ocean, not in the air, where you and I are now. So most of the living space on the planet is in the ocean. Life evolved in the ocean. The ocean controls the carbon cycle, the oxygen cycle. Every second breath of oxygen that you and I are breathing comes from plankton in the ocean. So the ocean, actually, not the land, controls all of these chemical cycles that are the building blocks of life. So as we impair the ability of the ocean to provide those services, we're also imperiling, the future of life on our planet. So that's what I mean when I talk about the life support system of the planet.